Be the envy of the neighborhood. 860 KKAT, where the grass is always greener. Welcome to Gardening Utah. Here's composter and show hoster, Jenna Francis.
Welcome to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jenna Francis. Every week here on Gardening Utah, we give you gardening inspiration and advice from experts across the state. We talk about all things vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, and of course, your lawn. Thank you for listening. We really hope that this show is something that you'll look forward to checking in with every week. Episodes drop every weekend on Apple Podcasts to get you ready for working in the yard. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. This show also airs on KKAT 860 AM on Saturday and Sunday at 10 a.m. here in Utah. My hope is that this is a fun and informative show that you can listen to while you're starting to get to work in the garden or while you're out and about shopping at nurseries and garden centers, so you can be inspired and stay in the know of the tasks that you need to accomplish in the yard that week. So let us know what you would like to see on Gardening Utah. Message us on Instagram. Our handle is @GardeningUtah, and we can have one of our experts answer your question on an upcoming show. Now, on today's show, we'll be talking with our guest, Cynthia Bee, a professional landscape designer from Localscapes, and she is a wealth of information. So if you're doing anything in your yard, whether it's trying to improve a section or putting in an entirely new yard, you have to stay tuned to this show. It's fascinating. Together, Cynthia and I will be talking about the 5 steps to take to design your perfect yard that is beautiful, functional, water-wise, and even if you're already done with your yard. So what is a localscape? The localscape approach is a series of landscaping patterns and practices that takes into account Utah's unique climate. It's good landscape design simplified. Localscaping teaches you how you can have a landscape that works for you where you live. So we'll get into all of that with Cynthia in a minute. But first, the tip of the week.
860 KKAT with your Gardening Utah tip of the week.
My tip of the week is go local for your gardening advice. Now, this is incredibly important for many reasons. Recently, I was watching a YouTube video on planting, and the advice was to always add peat moss and sand when you're planting. Well, this is not good advice for Utah soils. Sand can cause clay-like soils to develop a concrete-like consistency. So even advice on growing sod from other areas than Utah, Idaho, and Colorado can be something that you just shouldn't do here. So my tip is go to your local extension service for advice, which in our area is USU. So if you're Googling, type in what it is you're searching for and add USU extension to it. Then you will find USU's extension service's well-researched advice that will be relevant to Utah. So get your info close to home. And that was the tip of the week.
Never miss a tip for your garden and never miss an episode. The Gardening Utah Podcast with Jenna Francis at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jenna Francis.
Okay, so let's get into some of the gardening-related events coming up in Utah. A lot has changed with the COVID-19 restrictions loosening up a bit, so here's a few fun outdoor places that are opening back up. And this isn't in a complete list, but it's just a few that caught my eye that may be of interest to our listeners. So Thanksgiving Point is reopening in limited capacity, the Butterfly Biosphere, the Museum of Ancient Life, Ashton Gardens, and Farm Country. Over in West Jordan, I believe, Gardner Village, of course, as an outdoor village. So as of May 16th, they are starting their Woodland Fairies theme. And if you've never been there, it's adorable. So fun for kids to walk around and see and discover all the different fairy decorations and things like that, and to dress up themselves as well. It's a lot of fun, and it's outdoors. They also have the farm there, the little petting zoo run by Farmer Gill. That's so amazing. And that's open from 10 to 8 as well. So really fun place to go and get outside and see all the beautiful spring flowers is Gardner Village. Now, Red Butte Gardens is hosting a special tomato plant sale and fundraiser. Not only will you get an assortment of beautiful tomato plants, but your purchase will also help support Red Butte Gardens when they need it most. So you can find more information on Red Butte Gardens tomato plant sale at redbuttegarden.org for more information, because it's more of an online purchase and a pickup, just to kind of, keep safety as a concern. So Tracy Aviary is open as of May 2nd. So Tracy Aviary is open every day from 10 to 5. It's so much fun. I love going there. Hogle Zoo is also open. And so, yeah, there's a bunch of fun. A lot of these amazing places that are outdoors are able to open back up. And, a lot of them have lost a lot of revenue from this crisis. So definitely, if you can get out there and you feel comfortable, go and, support the places that you love the most. Okay, so before I tell you more about our special guest coming up after the break, I wanted to share something that I'm going to do just because it's something I'm super passionate about. I am completely and totally obsessed with iris. I collect a ton of different, a lot of bearded special varieties that I've bought through the last, my goodness, probably 20 years. And I have moved my iris to every home I've ever lived in and collected iris from specialty growers as well as from my grandmother's garden and things like that. Anyway, probably as in your yard as well, my iris are in full bloom. So what I want to do, I'm going to do an Instagram live on the @GardeningUtah Instagram. So just look us up on Instagram. It's @GardeningUtah. And if you're hearing this later on, I'll put it on our Instagram television on IGTV, so you'll be able to look at it. But if anyone has any curiosity about the iris that I have in my yard, and if you're passionate about iris and kind of taking little virtual garden tours, I go to the Gardening Utah page and check it out. I usually have so many friends and family that come over to my yard every year when my iris are in bloom. And this year, obviously, that's not happening as much. So I figured I really wanted to share. And why not share it with other people passionate about gardening? So check it out @Gardening Utah. Go to our IGTV if you're hearing this later, and you can watch a little virtual tour of my iris garden. So there you have it. Now, let's talk about our upcoming guest, Cynthia Bee. She is absolutely incredible. She is a professional landscape designer for Localscapes. She has a degree in landscape architecture from Utah State University and a minor in horticulture. She spent the last decade teaching homeowners how to DIY landscapes that work in Utah's climate. Over the years, she's helped thousands of homeowners create better yards as one of the instructors for Localscapes and the Conservation Garden Park. And let me just tell you, Utah is very lucky to have this woman. We have a completely fascinating conversation. I learned so much from this. And listen, if you have already put in your yard, there are still so many amazing tips that Cynthia gives us. And I cannot wait to implement some of these in my current yard. And we talk about ways that you can save money with rebates that are going on right now for doing certain things in your yard, like perhaps improving your sprinkler system, maybe turning that park strip into something different with the Flip Your Strip program. So we get into all of that, and it's a really, really fun conversation. So we'll be right back after the break with our special guest, Cynthia, to discuss all things Localscapes. Stay with us.
She's more than just gardening puns and sage advice. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. Here's Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me in our virtual studio today is Cynthia Bee, who is the professional instructor with Localscapes. Cynthia, I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having us.
This is so much fun, and I've wanted to have you on the show ever since I found out about Localscapes, so I'm really glad you took some of your free time today to talk to us about this. Why don't you give us the background about Localscapes?
So Localscapes is kind of a 5-step design method that was created specifically for Utah. We find that a lot of the landscape advice that you find comes from all parts of the country, and some of it is not only not right for Utah, it's actually wrong for Utah. And so we felt like we're different enough that we need our own landscape style based on our climate and the best practices and our soils and all the craziness that is Utah. And so that's what Localscapes kind of started from.
Gosh, you just hit on a hot button, because at the beginning of the show, I talked about my tip of the week, which was to really go local with your, sourcing for information because of how unique our climate and our soil and everything is. And that's why I think Localscapes is so interesting.
Yeah, the other thing that was kind of foundational for Localscapes that you won't find in almost, I found very few garden books anywhere that even address it. We have sprinkler systems, and that changes everything about design. And I'll never forget the moment I had this little realization. I was standing in front of this beautiful landscape in South Jordan that I personally knew was water-wise, but no one driving by would know it. It just looked like a great yard. And as I was analyzing why it worked, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh my goodness, I have been trained to do this backwards. We shouldn't be designing sprinklers to fit landscapes. We should be designing landscapes to fit sprinklers. And that changes everything.
Wow. That makes so much sense. Walk us through the steps to Localscape. Let's start
okay. So the way that most design takes place is everyone assumes a green ground plane of grass. You don't even know you're assuming it. If you even open landscape design software, the ground is green. Okay, but that's not really true here in Utah. So that's the kind of opening mistake that we make before we even know we made one. And then you just think about what you want to add to the yard. So typically people will design the shape of flower beds, and they'll add this and they'll add that, and just kind of prop it on top of the lawn. And then when you try to put sprinklers on that, it makes a big mess. And so instead, we want you you can still have lawn in a Localscape, but it's going to be a designed, planned element instead of a default ground cover. So in a Localscape, you're not designing the shape of planting beds, you're designing the shape of the lawn. And that is why you get all the great benefits that you are getting. So the very first step in a Localscape is that central open shape. So it's a single bold shape in the front yard and in the backyard. Obviously, about 90% of people are going to choose to do lawn for their central open shape, but you could also do ground cover or gravel or hardscape. That's up to you. But you've got to have that as an organizing feature so things don't look messy. And when you have that kind of that beautiful bold shape of green, it has one edge to trim and maintain. And so you can get in and out on your Saturday really quickly. Like we had someone go from a regular, just generic Utah typical yard in their front yard down to a Localscape, and they cut their mowing edging every Saturday down to 7 minutes.
Whoa.
So that you still have a big enough piece of lawn that it's usable, but the sprinklers can irrigate it efficiently. You don't have any obstructions in it. Lawn is just lawn. And we're using it in the places where it can serve as an active recreation space. And that's how we need to be thinking about lawn in Utah. Right now, we think about it as a default ground cover, but what it really is an active recreation surface. And so we only use it in places where it can serve that function. Park strips, you don't want to be recreating in a park strip. Side yards, lawn doesn't do so well there anyway. So it's not generally, in most side yards, a good choice in the first place, right? So we're putting lawn where it's usable, and then by putting it in that bold shape, so it's not just even having less lawn. If you combine it all together into that one piece, then your lawn is just totally usable, and that's what we want. It's our highest water plant. It's the diamond. We want to treat it that way. So, if everybody's special, nobody's special. And that's one of the things that's really interesting for my lawn lovers out there. When it's just lawn, it visually disappears. But when you do it as a Localscape and you have it as that bold shape in the middle, it becomes the focal point. Your eye is drawn to the lawn by everything around it. And so, that's kind of how we want to make that work.
It's such a
So that's the first step.
Yeah. And that's such a fascinating thought, because I'm thinking about, some backyards that I've even seen recently. And it's like you put up your vinyl fence and then you chuck down your sod and all the way to the fence, and that's it. And that's just not what you want to do in Utah. It's just not water-wise in any way.
Well, and it's a lot more work over time. So it's quicker and faster in the beginning, and then you pay for it every Saturday for the duration.
Definitely.
And so, so we want to get things. And then it's also about how our neighborhoods sync together too. When you have that Localscape with that central open shape, and that means there's some plants around the edges, it means each yard sort of blends into the next one. And so you get this really beautiful fit. And so that each neighbor, anyway, it just looks really great on a large scale as well. Okay, so that's the first step. Okay. Then the next thing is gathering areas.
I love this.
No, people just don't have enough of that. So gathering areas are the social spaces where you're going to interact with family and friends. Most people have a back patio that's usually too small. And so we want, in Localscapes, we tell you to have at least 3 gathering areas. Put one in the front yard. Make the one in the backyard quite a bit bigger. Get like a third option, maybe in a back corner or something for a fire pit, or all these other ways to use the yard. Because it's really interesting when we talk to people about how, they talk about how they want to use their yard and how they imagine their lifestyle in their yard. It's almost always about the gathering areas, but they don't realize, they just throw out a lot of lawn and that's not achieving it. And here's the great thing about gathering areas as well. Once you have them in place, they're almost no maintenance. So by having more of these functional spaces that don't require a lot of work, you're making a balance in your yard between the things that need work and water and the things that don't. And that's the key to a really great functional yard.
I love that.
Yeah, gathering areas are huge.
Yeah, because I'm just realizing when we put in our yard, I still have a half an acre to go, but I've done one half. We did a large kind of gathering area around a fire pit. And if in the last 7 years, I haven't had to do anything to that, but boy, the plants and the, the grass around it, I sure have. So this makes so much sense.
Yeah. Okay. And so then the next step number 3 is activity zones. So if gathering areas are kind of the passive hangout spaces, activity zones are how do you want to use your yard? And this is going to vary, obviously, by all the different homeowners and what you're interested in. So, for some people, they're going to have a vegetable garden and chicken coops. And some people, it's going to be children's play areas. Trampoline's a great example. There's probably almost no one in Utah that hasn't had to drag a trampoline across their yard at some point. And instead with Localscapes, we're like, give it a place to happen. Take that back corner, that used to be lawn, and create, pull the lawn out of that area, cap off the sprinkler heads, put down some bark mulch or whatever else, really heavy, and put your trampoline there. And so you're not hauling it around. And then you're also, again, taking more area out of active weekly maintenance. So there's lots of different ways. And activity zones, we've seen everything from giant chessboards, it can be whatever works for your family. But the thing is, people think of, I have lawn and we'll just use it. But kids aren't going to go and take the time to set up lawn games and everything. But if you have that playhouse already there, if you have that trampoline already in a good location, if you have already created these opportunities that draw them outside, now you're going to get them out there. Absolutely. So that's a big part of it.
I love the chessboard idea.
Oh, it's so cute. We have lots of great examples, and we always are looking for more. So, but yeah, there's so many different ways to do it. So start creating those things. But again, with the activity zones, it's the same benefit as the gathering area. Other than vegetable gardens, most activity zones are no maintenance spaces or very low maintenance spaces. So, again, we're getting those things put together that are going to, we're going to balance between the things that need work and water and the things that don't. And right now, people typically think it's either grass or it's plants. And we need to pull away from that a little bit. No, there's these other things that we bring into the yard that are really where we're getting the benefit.
Absolutely. And if you really think about it, if you think about the places that you've been, that you have the most fun, neighbors' yards, or, other places, it's where they do have that kind of activity zone that, makes the yard stand out so much too.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so the first 3 things we've talked about are kind of like spaces, right? They're square footage spaces. The next thing we want to do, step number 4, are paths. We want to connect these things together so we have good way to work our way around the yard. And so paths kind of guide you through the landscape and between potential activities. And what we see a lot of times is we use lawn as a path. But, anyone with a dog knows that if you walk on the same place over and over again, it doesn't hold up well over time. Plus, when we talk about, the whole maintenance aspect of that, a 4-foot wide path cannot be irrigated very well. And you've got all of that edging on either side of it. Oh. So we just want to avoid using lawn as a path entirely. And instead, vary that ground plane texture by bringing in, you can use the crushed stone, the chat, the flagstone. There's very cost-effective ways to make your paths, but there is something about just having that material change and having that pathway created. It brings this whole sense of interest and mystery to a yard. And I know this because when we have student tours at the Conservation Garden Park, the minute the main path diverges to a little side path, you lose all the kids. They've got to see where it goes. It just sparks adventure and interest. And so we're making it more functional as well. And so really think about changing that up. And then once you have the path, awesome. Not a lot of work involved with keeping it going.
Isn't that the truth? I love that. I know. I mean, kids running off into the little paths. This is so inspiring for me. I'm doing this in my yard. I'm so happy.
Glad. Okay. So then the last step number 5, are planting beds. And Basically, planting beds fill the gaps after you've added all of these things. And so it's weird because when you look at your yard, you're not seeing the ground plane. You're seeing everything rising from it. But when you're designing a landscape that's going to work and that's going to function, it's the ground plane you need to worry about. And then we can put the plants on. The plants are like the last 10%. And probably the number one question that I get as a design expert is, what plants should I be using? And there's no plants good enough to fix bad design. So we want to start with a good design in the first place, and then the plants will do nothing but enhance it. And that's the beauty of a localscape. Because you already know all your functional elements are covered, your plants are always going to be in the right place.
Isn't that the truth? Especially when you're planning the water source after the fact, correct?
Right. Yeah, so planting beds are always going to be drip irrigated, and we can talk a lot more about why that's so important, but it really makes all the difference. And so one more thing on the steps, as you're getting those 5 steps down and making your adjustments, if at the end you look at it and go, it's too much planting bed, that's too much, no problem. Add more of 2, 3, and 4. Widen out your paths a little bit. Instead of a 4-foot path, make a 6-foot path. And that's taking that much more area out that you would be maintaining, or add another gathering area, or create a new activity zone. Getting that balance between the 5 elements is really going to drive the amount of work that the yard is for you.
I'm loving this so much. Cynthia, this is so inspiring for me. I can't wait. So, all right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk more about drip irrigation and these planting beds. Stay with us.
860 KKAT with Jana Francis and Gardening Utah, where it's always mulch time. When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah, available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden. She really does have the nicest yard on the block. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm Jana Francis, and with me in our virtual studio is Cynthia Bee with Localscapes. Cynthia, we are having such a fun conversation.
It's so fun to be here. I love talking about localscapes. I'm such a nerd.
Well, I am too. And one of my big things is when you start with the right plan and you have proper design, you will save yourself so much time and money and water. Saving water is one of my absolute passions and hot buttons. And so we were talking a little bit about irrigation for the planting beds. So let's pick up right there.
Yeah, so people, like we talked about kind of that all or nothing thinking, it's planting beds or it's lawn. And we get the same thing with efficient design. It's either wall-to-wall grass as a landscape, or as I call it, a cheapscape, or it's, a zero-scape with nothing going on. Now, those are both the extremes. Localscapes encompasses kind of a good spectrum between those crazy extremes. And so now you can be fully xeric and be a localscape, but we're working on something that's going to work a lot better. And so one of the ways we achieve that is by controlling. So if you want to control weeds, you've got to control water. And so in a localscape, the only place you have overhead spray irrigation is on the lawn. And that's one of the reasons we put it in that bold shape, right? Because then the sprinklers work better. Everywhere your sprinklers are spraying your planting bed, you are cultivating weeds. And one of the hardest things for us in explaining localscapes to locals has just been, people know if I have planting beds, it gets a lot of weeds, but they don't know why. They just assume I have planting bed, therefore I'm going to have a ton of weeds. But it's your irrigation practices and your cultivation practices that are really driving it. And so in a localscape, we will have the planting beds all on drip irrigation. And then this is great because it doesn't matter if the planting beds are really wiggly, squiggly, circuitous, or whatever, because drip irrigation can be bent to any shape without losing efficiency. And the same is not true of overhead spray. So what we want to do is try to keep the overhead spray just to the lawn, and then that drip irrigation watering only the plants we want to keep and not the weeds. So we're going to try to create ideal conditions for our plants and the least ideal conditions possible for weeds. So part of that, we have what we call the Localscapes weed control recipe. And like any recipe, if you don't do all 5 things, then, it's not going to work for you. But the number one thing, of course, is planting beds on drip irrigation. So right there, we're controlling water and we're making conditions less. The next thing is making sure that you've got a heavy coat of mulch, 3 to 4 inches. Now, most people just put a skiff down so the soil looks brown. But what you really want to do is get that 3 to 4 inches so it shades out the soil. And so any weed seed that's in the soil doesn't get the sunlight that it needs to grow. And here's the magic thing. That's exactly how weed barrier fabric supposedly works. It's not by being a physical barrier that stops weeds. It supposedly stops the sunlight from getting to the soil. But weed barrier fabric itself becomes a weed. So we do not recommend weed barrier fabric in planted areas. Instead, use that heavy coat of mulch. You'll achieve the same thing without starving the soil of water and oxygen, and without harming, worms and microbial life in the soil, which is what happens when you have, especially if you have clay soil, when you use weed barrier fabric. So the only place we use fabric is like under paths or in unplanted areas. Yeah. So that step. So we're controlling weed, water. We're adding that mulch, which also helps keep the water from evaporating out of the soil. We're not using weed barrier fabric. And then, every so often, if you have to use chemicals, that's up to you to decide whether or not you will. But our goal is to minimize your need for it. So if you're constantly needing to use chemicals, then your cultivation practices are wrong. And that's what needs to change first. So if you're doing these first few things, and we do recommend a pre-emergent in the spring as well. So if you're doing those first things, it should minimize your need for using chemicals through the season.
Absolutely.
Or eliminate if you're able to stay on top of it. So,
yes, I can attest for how much just, conserving the water from the areas and then, having the mulch down is so important, and it absolutely works to prevent weeds.
Yeah, in fact, I've got a spot in my yard right now. I was mulching before COVID-19 hit. I was trying to because, when you work in this industry, if you don't get your stuff done early, forget it. Your yard's going to be a hot mess all season. Because once things get busy, we're in everyone else's yards, not our own. And so I was trying to get my mulch down. And of course, then everything happened and then I couldn't. And it's really interesting now, all these weeks later, you can see exactly where I got it mulched and where I didn't by the number of weeds that are out there right now, which is probably what I need to do this afternoon.
Wow. I'm thinking right now, there's a huge section I have the same that we were actually, it is under spray, which I'm fixing this year. I'm putting in drip everywhere that doesn't have drip yet. But everything you're saying is like, I could have saved so much time over the last 7 years if I just started correctly.
Well, a lot of what we've learned because we did it wrong first. So it's okay. But, there actually is a really great product that you can use to switch irrigation zones over to drip, and it didn't used to be so easy. So you do have to, if you're going to switch your planting beds over to drip, you do have to switch the whole zone, but you can buy a retrofit kit at any of the sprinkler irrigation supply stores. You will not find it at the box store. And all you do is unscrew one of your sprinkler heads, pull the guts out, put the new guts in, screw the top on, and it has the drip irrigation line. It has the pressure reducer and the filter built right in. And you can just run your line straight from there and then cap off your other sprinkler heads. So if you were going to do a whole zone, I would probably do a retrofit head on either end of the zone, just in case you ever get a clog in the line so you got water coming from both directions. And then cap off the rest of them and away you go. You could literally do this without a shovel. I can see your jaw dropping right there. I can see that was like, what?
I've got my hands on my cheeks right now because you just answered the question that I have been meaning to sit down and research for months, because I had no idea that I could. I knew there was probably a way that I could leave what I have and just add on to it, but I didn't realize it was that easy. And it doesn't sound like one of those honeydew projects meaning it's going to have to add to my list of everything I need my husband to help me with. It almost seems like something that I can do. Okay.
Yeah, anybody can do it. I do all the irrigation at our house. But the drip lines are so simple, and it's all above grade too. And that's one of the things that's so nice is when I buy a new plant, in my areas where I'm doing what's called point source drip, which means you run a little spaghetti tube to the plant.
Yes.
I do that in some areas. And then most of the time I just use the inline drip where every 12 inches it has an emitter. But in any case, the point is, as soon as I add a new plant, I just run a little drip line to it as I'm planting, and I know that the plant's going to get what it needs. And it's so simple. We do have a whole class series too through Localscapes that teaches all of this. We're not doing our irrigation workshop right now because of COVID-19, but we do have, for people that are overwhelmed by that, we have a whole irrigation workshop where we do hands-on. We work with the parts, so you're actually seeing the real sprinkler parts as they're put together, and it just takes down the intimidation factor. Once you've seen it done and done it your first time, then it's really, really simple going forward.
Yeah.
It just is one of those things that feels overwhelming at first.
Okay, I love this. When we come back right after the break, we're going to get more information on where people can find out about these classes, and we're going to continue talking about Localscapes right here on Gardening Utah. Stay with us.
It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis on 860 KKAT. 860 KKAT with more of the fastest growing show on radio. It's Gardening Utah with Jana Francis.
Welcome back to Gardening Utah. I'm your host, Jana Francis, and with me in our virtual studio today is Cynthia Bee, professional instructor for Localscapes. We're having such a blast talking about all these amazing, new thinking around how you can really plan the proper yard. And why don't you quickly, for the listeners who are just joining us, why don't you give us the overview of the 5 steps? Just review those really quickly with the 5 steps of Localscapes.
Yeah. Okay, so the 5 steps are: first, central open shape. This would be lawn, ground cover, gravel, hardscape, but it needs to be kind of that visual centerpiece feature. Step number 2, gathering areas, creating at least 3, maybe more, places to socialize and hang out. Step number 3 are activity zones, and these are all the active spaces, so your sporting spaces, your vegetable garden, any things that you want to actually do in the yard, giving them a place to be that's permanent. And then, of course, paths that connect these spaces. And then at the end, leftover spaces that you aren't using for these functional purposes, that's where the planting beds go. And so when you group these 5 steps together, it works for any property, any shape property, any size property. That Localscapes element, those elements combine really well together just to make a great functional yard.
I've just loved this so much because it makes so much sense to me. And, we were talking a little bit about irrigating, and you'd mentioned some rebates. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. So we are working through Utah Water Savers, and that's utahwatersavers.com. And that's where you can find a lot of the programs for the state. And anyone in the state of Utah can get a smart controller rebate. And I would recommend having one even if just everything else aside, just being able to handle your sprinkler system from your smartphone is worth it. So anyone can get a smart timer rebate. But those that are in most of Salt Lake County, Jordan Valley Water Conservancy District is funding landscape rebates that are called Localscapes Rewards and the Flip Your Strip Park Strip program. So if you're doing either a park strip or you're doing, a larger project, a front yard or a backyard, and you are in that service area for Jordan Valley Water, you can get money back for making these changes. Now, it won't be enough to pay the whole cost, but if it's a project you were planning to do anyway, it's really, really nice to get extra money back.
Absolutely. I've actually seen the Flip Your Strip commercials and thought to myself, I immediately texted my husband, because we do have, unfortunately, a little bit of a grass park strip. I'm not even sure why it was originally put in, but we are going to be taking that out. And so I was excited to learn more about that for sure.
Yeah, that has been so fun to watch that catch on. So, of course, all Localscapes are going to have flipped park strips. But to see the park strip idea itself catching on, we started calling it the gateway drug to a Localscape. Because most people aren't that emotionally attached to their park strip. Of all the places in their yard that they don't really care that much about changing. So we figure if we can get them to do that well and they have a good experience with that, now they're going to be more willing to try out the rest of that Localscapes method.
Isn't that true? Because, how many times are you walking up or down the street or in a new neighborhood and seeing these sprinklers that are overwatering the streets and the gutters just to keep a useless park strip of grass green?
Right. It makes no sense. It's just a lot of water waste. And one of the things with Localscapes is we don't ever put lawn anywhere that it's less than 8 feet wide. Because again, that's where you're starting to get all of that waste. The other thing with park strips and lawn is just that because of all the hot space around it, that piece of lawn in the park strip requires more water to stay green than the lawn in your yard. So it's not just that it's lawn, it's that that placement of lawn requires so much more. So, if you flip your park strip, you're saving an average of 8,000 to 10,000 gallons of water per season. And you ready for this little piece of information? The average quarter-acre lot in Utah uses almost 200,000 gallons of water per season for the landscape.
That makes me sick to my stomach. 200,000
gallons. Yeah, and that's the drinking water. People with secondary water, they're using even more. on average, because, conservation, a lot of people have said to me, oh, I don't have to worry about conservation. I have secondary water, or if I don't use that water, it will just be wasted. It's not wasted. Even if it ends up in the Great Salt Lake, that's awesome. The lake needs it and we need the Great Salt Lake. So, the water, if you don't, it's not a use or lose. And it's also kind of like prescription medications, right? If some is good, more is not better.
Right.
And so when we're overwatering those lawns, it's not making it better. It's inviting disease. It's making for a really weak lawn that isn't resilient. So our goal with Localscapes is to give these different elements the amount of water they need and no more.
Yeah.
And so a Localscape, that same quarter-acre Localscape, is about 65,000 gallons of water, yet it still has lawn, and it's still the best-looking landscape in the neighborhood. And that's one of the things that's been so fun for us is we watch, once someone does a Localscape and they do it well, you start seeing the neighbors make those same changes because it's the best-looking yard, and they've just upped the standard for everybody. But again, using that substantially less water to do it. So it's kind of, it's a lot of fun to see this catching on with Utah.
Well, and you know what, when I was listening to your TED Talk the other day, which by the way, if you've not heard Cynthia's TED Talk, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a really great outline on everything we've kind of just talked about. I will put a link to watch that podcast in the episode notes of this show. So, but it's on YouTube. You could Google, go to YouTube and type in Cynthia Bee. What would be another keyword they would need to look up for that?
I think they call it 5 tips for landscaping for where you live, because they got to give it a marketing kind of title.
Sure. Okay. So you can find it on YouTube under looking for that, but she discusses how the purpose of a yard is to spend time enjoying it and not spending all of your time working in it. And that was a key that just, it really hit home with me.
Oh yeah. And it's been so fun to hear back from people that have Localscaped. So how do you learn to Localscape? We actually have a class series that's available, usually not during COVID, in person, but we are doing a series of webinars through the month of May. We have online courses already. So our introduction class is about an hour-long class, and we just go over, how these things all work together, and we go over the 5 steps. The second class in this series is Localscapes University, and that's a little bit longer class, and that's where we start digging into the how do you do these things. And I want to be really clear, you don't need a blank slate yard for this. Localscapes was very specifically designed to be modular. So if you have a brand new yard, you'll start by doing that central open shape and work your way to the edges as you're installing the yard. And for those with an existing yard, you're going to start in the opposite. You're going to start by carving away at those edges and bringing that lawn into a central open shape and adding these other elements in the places where you've pulled that lawn. So it works forwards and backwards, basically, depending on where you're at on the spectrum. And that's very much by design. Because 80% of the people that we're teaching are people who are just trying to fix something, an existing yard that wasn't done right the first time. So, the only thing worse than doing it the first time is having to redo it when it didn't work. And that's what we want to do. We want to help people save money by having a good design that even if, DIY, we'll teach you, and then implementing it as time and budget allow. So the third class in the series, and these 2 are optional classes. If you want, you can take the irrigation class that we talked about in the last segment. And then we also have a design workshop where we actually bring in professional designers. And that's for people who have already kind of got the Localscapes thing figured out. And we sit down and you design your own yard in the workshop. And then, of course, there's the rebate program, the Localscapes Rewards program that applies to some areas. And that's just cash back that you can get for making this happen. And the way they justify, those are funded by water districts because of the water savings that your yard is producing and what that saves the taxpayers in the cost of additional water supply development. So it's saving you in a lot of different ways by doing this Localscape, but it is money up front, and that's the hard part. So we're trying to make that a little less painful. And we're just seeing it one of the most exciting recent things, Ivory Homes has just announced that every new community they build is getting Localscaped. So, to get the building community on and new development on, they joined Garbett Homes and the Building Group and Alpine Homes are all builders that are offering Localscapes. And this is huge because one of the biggest problems we have are new construction homes, where homeowners don't know, like builders aren't that interested in landscaping, right? Homeowners have no idea how much it costs to put in a yard. And so they're completely unprepared for that. And so we just get this rolling out of these blandscape cheapscapes just because no one put any thought into that. And so we're trying to make that a little easier up front and say, hey, no, you're selling a house with a property and you need to think about the whole thing. That's what people are buying. And so it's been really neat to see these builders catch the vision and jump on board as well.
I love to hear that. And what is the one thing that you continually hear realtors say that increases the value of your home is the landscaping.
Yeah, to have good curb appeal. And really because of the way that these elements work together, that's really a huge driving factor. In almost every place they've gone in, the Localscape is the best landscape in the neighborhood. So it's a very upgraded look, but we can teach you all the different ways to get that look without breaking the bank, or to do it a project at a time. But a lot of times, people just take on a little project here or there, and there's no thought about the larger overall goal. And so then they end up redoing, and they're not making progress. And so that's what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that the time and money that you put into your yard, each piece of that is moving you closer to this Localscapes end goal.
Yes, where you have less mowing, less edging, less watering, less weeding, less headache, and more beauty, right?
Yeah, and more ways to enjoy the yard.
Absolutely.
So there's lots of activities to choose from.
Yeah, I mean, entertain your family and friends, and it's so much more fun to go out into a yard that has all these different little sections and beauty than just one with a whole big strip of sod, right?
Right. Yeah, so it really does give you that end result that's, what everyone's trying to get. It's just there's not been a real clear path to get you from where you are to that spot.
Yeah.
So, and then we teach these classes in person as well. So we have the different conservation botanical gardens in the state where they're taught, from St. George all the way up into Layton. And now Utah State University Extension is teaching Localscapes too. So they're going to be able to help us bring that to all parts of Utah. So we're really excited. There's also online classes, which you can take right now. So, and you can find all of these classes at localscapes.com.
Okay, perfect. So
as well as lots of free resources.
Okay, perfect. So is that so we've got 1 minute left before we head into our extended show in our Gardening Utah podcast on Apple Podcasts. So let's give the listeners that are listening here on KKAT everything they'd need to know to contact Localscapes. So it's just localscapes.com?
Correct. So we're on social media, so join us there. And we're always posting great tips and ideas for your Utah yard in those locations. And all of it is stuff that applies to you.
And so on social media, just looking up the word Localscapes?
Yep. So we're on Facebook. We're Localscapes on Facebook, Instagram. We have Pinterest boards with ideas that fit under those 5 steps to help people as they're trying to generate ideas for their yard.
Oh.
We're just trying to be everywhere you are.
You had me at Pinterest board. I'm going to go.
Oh, I know. I'm an addict.
I know. Okay, well, Cynthia, I cannot even tell you how much fun this has been. This has just been inspiring and mind-blowing. And everyone, go to localscapes.com and see what they can do for you. I can't wait to have you back on the show, Cynthia. You are amazing.
Oh, thank you. It's so fun to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you so much to Cynthia Bee from Localscapes for joining me today and giving us so many great tips. Isn't the state of Utah lucky to have her? Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. And look us up there now because Cynthia and I continue the conversation and we had a really interesting chat about so much more depth about Localscapes. So definitely look up Gardening Utah on your podcasting app and give us a listen. We also give shout outs on the show for 5-star reviews. So give us a 5-star review, show us some love, and we'll give it to you back on the show. And as always, shout out to our producer, Lambo. I'm Jana Francis. Thank you so much for listening to Gardening Utah. We'll see you next week. And remember, grow big or go home.
When you're ready to grow big or go home, make your neighbors green with envy. Get the Gardening in Utah podcast, Gardening Utah. Available wherever you get your podcasts and at 860kkat.com/garden.
You'll find everything for kids, for women, and the home. Everything you'd need to throw a great birthday party, gifts for friends, women's shoes, furniture for the home, and more. Steals.com is the perfect destination to have gifts delivered right to your door. Be inspired by Steals.com, where you can discover thousands of special items, all at amazing prices. At Steals.com, women are having fun discovering something new every day. It's a must-have for busy moms. Download the mobile app and make it easy to shop on the go. Now it's your turn. Discover new selections and unbeatable prices. Shop steals.com and start saving today. Steals.com, STEALS.com. Welcome back to Gardening Utah. This is the podcast only version. This is Jana Francis talking with Cynthia Bee, professional designer for Localscapes, and this has just been a riot.
Oh, I'm such a garden nerd. I just love talking about it with people. So
I do. Well, it's so funny because before we started recording, we had such a fun conversation about, so many things. And I thought, man, this is almost just as good as the show. So I remember a tidbit you mentioned that I really want to make sure our listeners hear. You mentioned about Denver and xeriscaping.
Yeah. Okay. So why Localscapes? Why do we do this whole thing when there's xeriscape? Localscapes is based on the principles of xeriscape, but the problem with xeriscape was that it didn't take into account the realities of people and human behavior and social and all of these different factors. It just really looks at the science, which is great, but social science is still science, and that's still important. And so, one of the things that happened with xeriscape early on is it was developed in Denver. It was what it's intended to mean is regionally appropriate landscapes. But then they had kind of this set of principles that were kind of like, reasonable areas of lawn. Well, what is that? Right? Well, it doesn't define it well enough for people. So it's kind of too abstract. But one of the things that happened, though, because it was such a new way of thinking back in the early 90s, is that the desert Southwest, Phoenix and New Mexico, they were in a crisis point and they had to make massive landscape change quickly. And so they grabbed a hold of the xeriscape concept. And of course, now when you think about xeriscape, we all associate it with the Southwest and not Denver. So when we started this, we have actually had other states ask us, hey, can we be part of Localscapes? We want to have Localscapes for Wyoming or, for New Mexico or wherever else. And we've told them no, because we developed this for Utah. This is our style and our landscape solution that we know works here. Now, it's modified a little bit for St. George because they're a little bit different climate, right? They're a little more desert. So our experts down there with the Red Hills Desert Garden and Washington County Water Conservancy District, they took those same 5 steps that we talk about in Localscapes, but they adjusted the plants and materials that they recommend to fit the locale down there. And that's the idea. You can get hyper local with Localscapes. We recommend different plants for people in Southwest Salt Lake County, Saratoga Springs, Eagle Mountain, any of those places where they're getting secondary water that is sourced from Utah Lake. They're getting extra salty water. So there's plants that I can grow in West Jordan that they can't grow because of the additional salt coming in from their water supply. So we've kind of got localized plants that we recommend to them. And that's why it's so important to get information as locally as you can, because things that are just standard in other places, like for example, I always hear people talk about, I've got that terrible clay soil. Well, why do we think it's terrible clay soil? Because all the garden books tell us that clay soil is terrible. Well, if you live in a boggy climate and your soil is never drying out, that is terrible. But that's not us. So here in Utah, having soil that can hang on to that water for a longer period of time, as long as you get it lightened up a little bit so your soil's still getting plenty of air and whatever else, and nutrient filtration, then clay soil is a benefit here, not a liability. And that's why that local information is so important.
I love that. It makes so much sense. And I actually brought that up as a tip of the week at the beginning of the show because, the inspiration behind that, though, just so if you're listening to the depths of this in the podcast, was because I was looking up some planting tips for different vegetables. And I noticed that the YouTubers were saying things like, oh, and when you plant this vegetable, always use sand and peat. And that's just not what you want to add to a Utah soil.
Correct. Yeah, that wouldn't work at all for us here. As we were starting this Localscapes journey, because we knew xeriscape just wasn't catching on the way it needs to. I mean, we're not in a crisis yet, but it takes a long time to change a yard. Yeah. And so when we started looking at this saying, our population's going to double and our water supply can't. It's just doesn't exist in space and time. So really it's a choose your change moment. We will have to change because water is a limiting factor. So it's just a matter of, do you want to act or be acted upon? Right. But anyway, and that's why I want people to do it gradually. So we did a whole focus group with people to figure out why xeriscape just wasn't catching. And one of the gentlemen summed it up so beautifully, and everyone around him nodded when he said this. And it really is one of the things that sparked this whole Localscapes approach. And he said, We equate water conservation with sacrifice. I'm giving up something of greater value for something of lesser value for the good of other people. Wow. So when you start looking at that from our perspective, and I'm trying to get them to change their yard, and I'm telling them, well, you've got to do this zero-scape thing that they think they hate because, people don't really understand what it is anyway. But if I'm trying to sell them on, hey, you need to do all of this change, spend all this money to change your yard to get something you don't want for a benefit you don't even perceive as a benefit to you, that's like, you don't have to know marketing to know that's a terrible sell, right? Like, who would do that? And so when we came out of that focus group, and our team just looked at that and said, you know what? We have to create something better. We have to create an approach that's going to save water, but also be an upgrade so that you're leaving with something better than what you had before. And if we can do that for people, they'll be happy to save the water. But they're not going to just do this to save water and then end up with something they don't want. And so that's when we really started digging in. Well, what do people want? And we came up with 10 key things that they need their yard to do, only one of which is the efficient with water. So they needed yards that had better curb appeal and that were more functional. They wanted privacy from neighbors. They wanted us to simplify this whole thing. It's too overwhelming. They needed to be able to do things in phases. So there's this whole list of things. And so we said, okay, that's our marching orders. Create a design approach that does as much of those things for people as we can while also conserving water. And if we do that, of course, people will want to do this. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, Localscapes is just really catching on quickly. And that's the reason, because they hear their problems in that. They know we're going to solve the problems they feel they have. So they're perfectly happy to save the water because they know it benefits them. It's just, if you're trying to sell that as the only reason to do it, it's not enough.
Yeah. That's so interesting. And you're right. It's kind of like the happy medium for everybody, right? It's a win-win negotiation.
Right. Now, if we get to a point where we really can't, like, let's say, well into the future, we get to a point where we really can't have lawn anymore. If you're already Localscaped, it's pretty easy to just switch that central open shape out to gravel or, even lower ground, whatever, to switch it out to something else. And you're there. You're not going to have to all of a sudden, like 2015 in California, when everyone all of a sudden had to re-landscape their entire yards quickly and badly. This way you have plenty of time to think about it. But your yard, essentially, we're building a yard that's more resilient, that's going to be able to handle it so that you're protecting your investment long term. And that's really the key, because it is money to put in a yard for sure. And so we want to make sure that the things that we're doing, we're only having to do them once, we're doing them correctly, we're doing it in a way that can be managed over time, and that's going to really solve for the challenges of the individual homeowner, but also our society as a whole.
Well, and what I love about it so much too is it's increasing the value of your property.
Right.
Yes, it's going to be an investment in the beginning, but look, it's increasing the value of your home. It's increasing the possible sale of your home if you get to that point at some point. And most of us sell a home in our lifetime, and whether that's on purpose or not. And what a great way to. And you're enjoying your yard, and you're spending less time having to work on it. And that's really only when you get sick of your yard, is when it's July and August and you're out there, it's your third month in a row, you're still pulling the weeds, you're still edging the lawn. Oh, and you've got so much lawn, and you've got the dry spot over here. And when you're just making it so much more manageable but fun, it changes everything.
Yeah, and there is, because you have your planting beds, there's a little bit more work in the spring and the fall in a Localscape, but then through the hot part, the miserable part of the summer, you're doing very little out there.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of those keys too. So, I'm really motivated at the beginning of the season, and then it sort of wanes. It's sort of like my motivation wanes with the temperature.
Yes.
And then in the fall, we can do, a few things there to clean up and whatever for winter. But so yeah, your workload's a little bit more spring, fall, and much, much less in the main part of the season.
Totally. Okay. So here's a question that I love to ask all of my guests.
Okay.
What is one mistake? Well, I think we've probably covered it, but what is one mistake that you see most Utah gardeners make?
Thinking that it's all about the plants or the bloom time of plants. So one of the biggest mistakes I see in terms of plants is a lack of foliage color. And when I was a young designer, I sat down and I would be like, okay, this is going to bloom in this 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, this is going to bloom. Yeah, this is Utah. Nothing can be relied upon that much. We get such extreme differences. Like things might bloom this week, this 2 week period this year, and next it's whatever. It might be 2 weeks later the next year.
Yeah.
But foliage color, once those leaves come on, you have that the whole season. So you're guaranteed that that's going to be colorful the whole time. Now, if it also blooms, that's an added bonus. And certainly you can plant things for blooms. So for me personally, like when I do perennials, I plan for every 3 that I plant, I make one about foliage. And if it also blooms, great. But by trying to get that contrast. So when you're doing your planting beds, plant density is another thing. So the hardest one to maintain is a low density bed. Because if you get one weed, you see it. So it's counterintuitive that having a more heavily planted space is less work. But like I had an area that I was apologizing to my neighbor because she sees it more than I do. And I said, oh, I got to get out there and weed that. I'm so sorry. It's been like a month and a half since I weeded. And she's like, no, it looks great. It looks great. And then I weeded it. And then she went, oh, I had no idea there were so many weeds in there, but because things just kind of work in. But so one of the things with that foliage, if you're doing a denser planting, then foliage becomes really important because it lets each plant still look distinctive. So you don't get green jungle. Because if everything has that same medium green leaf and you have like 10 different things in there, it just all sort of fades together.
Yeah.
Beauty is created through contrast. So each time you're putting plants together, you want some reason that they play off each other, that they add some kind of contrast. So it's never about just one plant. It's really about like 2 or 3 plants as a grouping is what you need to be thinking about.
I love that. I mean, I'm thinking about some of the plants in my yard that kind of accomplish that, everything from, it's like a dark, I forget the name, but it's a beech tree. It's a columnar beech tree that's a dark maroon leaf. And then right across from it, I've got a weeping redbud, which they just look amazing any time of year between the blooms in the spring and then the little heart-shaped leaves that are coming out. And then they're that
architectural form of the weeping tree that adds interest.
Totally. So
you're really looking for ways to contrast things. And now how vivid the contrast, that's a personal style thing.
Yeah.
But that's the thing to be thinking about, So if I'm buying a plant with medium green leaves, then I say, okay, well, when is it special? Like sometimes those plants that are just kind of boring, then all of a sudden they'll come on with these incredible flowers. So a good example is like a viburnum, right? Yeah. It's really just a boring green shrub. And then all of a sudden it blooms and it's either got amazing smell or really cool flowers. And then it just kind of fades out, right? So as long as you have these different things that are coming in and out, and that's the beauty of being part of that Localscapes ecosystem, because we have, we do a lot of help online for people that are taking Localscapes classes. We even have the Localscapes work group on Facebook. That's everyone that's trying to install yard projects, and that's where you get a lot of extra help and professional feedback, and that's all free. Just because our goal really is to do that. And we know that if we really help people get a good yard, that their neighbors are going to copy. It's going to spread. Absolutely. So we are really interested in investing in a lot in these, especially the early people that are doing this, because they're the ones setting the standard for what Localscapes is going to meet. Absolutely. And so that's really important to us, that it becomes something that is, that it really reaches its potential and creates these beautiful neighborhoods that we all want to live in without breaking our water bank.
Yes, absolutely. And so the Facebook page it's a group. And
there's a Facebook page, there's the general Localscapes page that anyone can follow. And then if you're actually working on landscape projects and taking the classes, you can join the private Localscapes work group.
Got it.
And that's where you get that extra help and feedback.
I'm going to be jumping in there today.
I'll approve you.
Yes. Okay. So another question that I ask my guests is, why do you love gardening?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's in the genes for me. My great-grandfather was a florist and my grandfather was a farmer, and it just was always a thing. And I've just always loved design. And I got into that, pretty young. And I've done design at different scales. I worked in city planning. I worked for parks. I've done it large scale. But I just developed a real passion for helping homeowners get something amazing. Because as a designer, I could create something really cool. But if the homeowner doesn't know how to maintain it and they don't feel an investment of themselves in it, it's never going to be what it could be. And so teaching people how to go from being overwhelmed about everything to do with their yard into turning it into something that they are proud to show off, I get such a charge from seeing that happen for people and helping them get to that point. And so I love that I don't have to worry about designing for clients anymore. I just get to educate people on how to make their best yard themselves. And I just take a lot of pleasure in that.
Oh, that is just so cool. I love that. How fun. Okay, well, geez, what else do you want to tell everybody before we go?
Oh my goodness, what else? What else? I think we hit like so many main points. It's probably kind of a little bit of a spew on my part. Sorry, I just love talking about it. So, there are just so many great plants. So with Localscapes, we do encourage the use of natives, but we are down with adapted plants too, as long as it's not invasive. Yeah. And really just trying to, reduce that. So we're not purists about that. And sometimes we take a hit, but it's really about practical sustainability. It's not about getting the most textbook perfect. I just got to get people moving, right? Localscapes is intended to bring you along a spectrum and to help you through that process rather than lecture you about what you should be doing.
Yeah.
So, that's really, we didn't want it to have that scold thing that is so often associated with water conservation. We wanted people to feel like, no, like that's an awesome side benefit that I'm getting, but really I'm just getting a great yard here, and how awesome that it's going to save water too. But that doesn't have to be the main thing. We don't need to change people and change, that, and that's one of the reasons Xeriscape has struggled is the opening premise is that you've got to get people to make that a value, that's such a high value that they're going to expend that kind of money to make that change. No. With Localscapes, we don't have to. What do you care about? What are you interested in? And here's a solution that solves for what you care about. And that's okay. It's okay to care about things besides water conservation. We'll show you how to keep that and save water, and then everybody's happy.
It's just so genius. I love it. I'm so happy to have you on the show. This has been a riot. And I can't wait to have you back. So anytime you have something else that you want to share with the Gardening Utah group of listeners, just let me know. We'll have you back anytime.
Sounds great. I'd love to come back. Thank you.
Gardening Utah listeners, thanks so much for being a part of our show today. Again, subscribe on Apple Podcasts and you'll never miss an episode. And we'll see you next week here on Gardening Utah.